What's going on, people? We are going through all of the best green cards and multicolored cards from the upcoming Magic the Gathering set Foundations, releasing on November 15th. The set is balanced for standard and is intended to be standard legal for about 5 years, possibly more, according to WotC. We are going through all of the best green and multicolored cards from the commander perspective to see which cards might move the needle. And boy, do I have to tell you guys, green got the absolute short end of the stick. I know I mentioned in my blue video that I thought that blue got the short end of the stick, but green really did. We really only have 3 or 4 commander playable cards from green, which we'll go over in just a second. But speaking of my other videos, I actually did all of the other color reviews, so white, blue, black, red, and then green and multicolored is the last video in this series. You can check out what I think about all the other colored cards in the links in the description below. Without further, with further ado, actually, I'd just like to ask if you enjoyed the video, leave a like on it and subscribe if you want to see more awesome content from me. All right, now without further ado, we can hop right into the card review and discussion here. First, we have Quilled Greatwurm, 6 mana 7/7 worm. It has trample, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage during your turn, put that many 1/1 counters on it, and you may cast this card from your graveyard by removing 6 counters from among creatures you control, in addition to paying its other costs. So this card obviously wants to go into a +1/+1 counter deck, and what I really like about this is actually the last ability always being there in your graveyard ready to be cast, because removing 6 1/1 counters in a +1/+1 counter deck is fairly trivial. And so I just really like the fact that if you happen to draw this card, and even if it's removed, you pretty much have it for the rest of the game, assuming that it's not exiled or something. But I was looking at comparables, and honestly I couldn't really find an equivalent for whenever a creature you control does combat damage during your turn, put that many 1/1 counters on it. We have some options like Colonial Hydra, which is honestly one of the best cards you could possibly draw in a +1/+1 counter deck, because whenever it attacks, double the number of 1/1 counters on each creature you control. So it is nice that Colonial Hydra gives it to you on attack, because then you can actually get in for damage with that extra power right away. And then I was also looking through my +1/+1 counter deck led by Atraxa Praetor's Voice, and I'm also running in the 6 CMC slot a Conclave Sledge Captain. And to be honest, I believe the Quilled Greatwurm will beat out the Conclave Sledge Captain, which says in particular, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put that many 1/1 counters on it. And because it has the backup ability, it gives that to other creatures. So you only get it really once a turn, whereas Quilled Greatwurm is going to be pumping this for as long as it's on the field. So I think Quilled Greatwurm, absolutely great creature, and will definitely beat out some of the 6 or 7 CMC options within those +1/+1 counter decks. But beyond that, I guess I don't know if I would run this in any other deck. It is a 6 mana 7/7 trample, which is nice. And I guess if you are able to get in consistently with evasive creatures, so if you're in like a Simic Ninja deck, or like a Simic Flyers deck, perhaps maybe like a Sultai Ninjas or Rogue type of deck, then I would maybe consider Quilled Greatwurm as an overrun effect. But it just kind of sucks that you have to wait to get the extra power boost before you actually get the value with Quilled Greatwurm. So anyway, that is Quilled Greatwurm. And once again, this would go in your +1/+1 counter decks. Atraxa Praetor's Voice. I also think this would be really cute in Skullbriar the Walking Grave, because Skullbriar decks are already built around allowing Skullbriar to get in for combat damage by giving it various evasive effects. And of course, counters remain on Skullbriar as it moves to any zone other than a player's hand or library. So Quilled Greatwurm is going to be a cool synergy piece with Skullbriar, as long as you can keep getting in for combat damage. Next, we have Spinner of Souls, 3 mana 4/3 Spider Spirit. Always nice to see Spider support. With Reach, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is incredible with sack outlets on board. I anticipate this will probably go in a lot of Aristocrats decks if you are proactively sacrificing your creatures. This basically says sacrifice a creature, draw a card, and draw a creature card, actually. So I think this is going to be super powerful in Aristocrats decks. We've seen this not exactly before. Evolutionary Leap, I think, is the best comparison, but in order to get that, you have to sack a creature, and then you reveal from the top to reveal a creature card. And there's also a very jank card called Foster. I've never even seen this card played. Does a similar impression. But Spinner of Souls, I think, is the best version of this effect we've seen so far, and I think this is going to go in, honestly, most most of your Spider decks and most of your Aristocrats decks. Thantis the Warweaver, I think, is a cool little synergy with Spinner of Souls because Thantis says all creatures attack each combat if able, and a Spinner of Souls says whenever non-token creature you control dies, which means that if Spinner of Souls can somehow survive combat by getting indestructible or something, then you can continue to swing in with Thantis and still get reap the benefits of your opponents having to swing in while you are drawing a bunch of cards if your creatures happen to be blocked and die in combat. And then Carador, of course, is a poster boy for all of the Aristocrats decks out there. Then we have Loot Exuberant Explorer, 3-mana 1/4. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and I think it's funny that somehow this is a creature type Beast Noble, as if Loot is somehow a noble in the story, I guess. I thought he was just sort of a thing that they found in a vault, and he's just kind of the plushie that they're taking along for the story. So I don't know how he became a noble all of a sudden, if some king anointed him to like a lordship. Anyway, you may play an additional land on each of your turns, 6-mana tap. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control from among them and put it on a battlefield. Put the rest of the bottom in a random order. So this is going to be one of the best additional land effects we've seen so far. Dryad of the Elysian Grove is still going to serve a purpose because it does mana fix you, but I do think that Loot will probably kick out the Wayward Swordtooths within people's decks because Loot gives you that payoff. It really gives you both the setup and the payoff on one card, which is classic WotC Fire design here. We're seeing a little bit more power creep, but Wayward Swordtooth, useful if you care about the power aspect, where if you care, sacrificing things equal to it and then drawing cards equal to its power, or something like that, or maybe just triggering on creatures entering to draw a card with power 3 or greater, then you would probably play Wayward Swordtooth. But I think in a generic deck, Loot would probably beat out a Wayward Swordtooth, and I think this goes straight into all of the Simic bullshit landfall decks. Personally, I have more than one of them, so this is definitely an archetype that I personally enjoy. I have an AC deck myself, but really you just want to keep stacking up those additional land effects in order to continue to play untapped mana, draw more cards, play more untapped mana, and really these decks become storm decks at the end of the day that are just not able to be interacted with because you're playing lands, which are less targetable in Commander. So both AC and Tatyova both want Loot for sure, and I think this would be an insta-slam in those decks. So that brings us to our green honorable mentions, just a couple on the list here. Preposterous Proportions is a cute card, 7-mana sorcerer. Creatures you control get +10/+10 and gain vigilance until end of turn. Vitalizing Wind is in shambles, ladies and gentlemen. If you were playing Vitalizing Wind before, you can just throw it straight in the trash and slot in Preposterous Proportions. Now, of course, Vitalizing Wind is an instant. Preposterous Proportions is a sorcery, but I just don't think that this particular effect is that playable in Commander because it doesn't give you that evasion you need to get through. But what I think really sets this card apart is that it gives vigilance, so it does protect you against the crackback, which is actually really valuable. I do like more resilient decks that are able to just swing with a lot of creatures while also being able to defend on their next turn. And I guess I asked myself, if you swing with enough power and toughness, let's just imagine for a moment that this card read, give your creatures you control +20/+20. At what point does that replace or does that generate more value by not giving the creatures evasion? So if you were to get, let's say you swing a board of 5 creatures at somebody, they're able to block 4 of them and 1 gets through. What is the actual number you need to make it worth not being able to just trample over the top with something like a Craterhoof Behemoth? And I don't think Preposterous Proportions quite meets that threshold. If you had like a 7-mana creature you control get +20/+20 gain vigilance until end of turn, then I would maybe realistically consider replacing a Craterhoof with it. But I think that, at the very least, you can swing out with your creatures, and then if they block, you're going to basically wipe their whole board. It basically forces them into a lure type of effect where they have to block or they just die. So I don't know. I'm curious to test out Preposterous Proportions. I don't think it's as good as a Craterhoof Behemoth or like a Moonshaker Cavalry, but I think it is an interesting card because it gives such a giant power toughness boost and protects you against the crackback. So I'll be testing this card a little bit in the upcoming weeks. Next, we have Quakestrider Ceratops, 6-mana, 12/8, just a vanilla body. And I absolutely love sort of the flavor of this card because a generic 12/8 will not be played in Commander, but much like a dinosaur that you would just sort of marvel at in the wild, we can see this card and marvel at it and go, wow, that's interesting, and then just not play it. So the comparison being Gigantosaurus, which is already a 10/10 for 5. If you are playing Gigantosaurus, I guess I don't know why you would replace this with a Quakestrider Ceratops, but it's very cool that at least in Standard we have a 6-mana 12/8 now. In Commander, I think this is pretty unplayable unless you are specifically comboing it with certain commanders like Trample, maybe like a Goreclaw or something might want this, but it just really doesn't do anything other than sit there as a big beefy body, and in Commander that's just not good enough in 2024. So I believe that brings us to our top 3 green cards, and we don't really have that many options to choose from given that we only have, I don't know, 3 in the actual main set review, but we'll bring us to the drum roll for Loot, Exuberant, Explorer, Spinner of Souls, and Quilled Greatwurm. I think Loot's going to go in the most amount of decks, and I think that this card is probably the best out of green in the entire set. Spinner of Souls, very cool in Aristocrats decks, and Quilled Greatwurm might be in the fringe of +1/+1 counter decks, but it's still, I think, a very cool effect nonetheless. So that will bring us to our multicolored section of the video. Let's start us off here with Zimone, Paradox Sculptor, 4-mana 1/4 human wizard. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures you control, and we can pay a green and a blue and tap it, double the number of each kind of counter on up to 2 target creatures and or artifacts you control. This is a lot of text smashed into one card, and I think that this does beat out a Varel of the Hulklade, which is a 3-mana 1/4. You can pay Simic and tap it to double the number of each kind of counter on target artifact, creature, or land. So for only 1 more mana, you get that same ability, but it can target an additional creature. It doesn't target the land, so you can't do land shenanigans, but I think that's still worth it to pay 2, double the number of each kind of counter and up to 2 target creatures and/or artifacts. And then, of course, it just puts 1/1 counters on things. So this is another sort of fire design where it gives you the setup and the payoff all on one card, which is pretty insane. I still think Bristly Bill is better as a finisher within +1/+1 counter decks, but I think that both as a commander and in the 99, Zimone is going to be very powerful, doing plenty of +1/+1 counter shenanigans. Also, you can do some jank shenanigans with this as well. You can power up the Millennium Calendar by doubling the number of counters on it to eliminate another step that you need to untap with it. Or if you wanted to do some other bullshit in Simic, Simic Ascendancy gives you that win condition if you have 20 or more growth counters on it. So of course with Zimone you can just double it to race 2 and I win the game conditions. So if you're into those types of win conditions, definitely consider these janker options a look, but I think this will probably mostly just appear on +1/+1 counter decks. Next we have Niv Mizzet Visionary, 6-mana 5/5 dragon wizard with flying. You have no maximum hand size, and whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you draw that many cards. Now, as if we didn't need more Niv Mizzets, I think there's at least 4 or 5 currently out there on Scryfall, but the most comparable Niv Mizzets would be Niv Mizzet Draco Genius, which whenever it deals damage to a player, you may draw a card and you can pay 2 to deal 1 damage. I think that Niv Mizzet Visionary is definitely more of a combo Storm Commander, and honestly, I think it's more powerful than all of the other Niv Mizzets we've seen so far, because you can... I really like the Storm build of this particular card, where if you were to play something like the new Bolt Wave, also from Foundation, Bolt Wave deals 3 damage to each opponent for only 1 mana. So now you can draw 9 cards for 1 mana by pairing it with Niv Mizzet Visionary. Absolutely insane. And I believe, like, I am reading that correctly. Double check me in the comments, but this does say whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you draw that many cards. So I believe the interaction here is Bolt Wave is 1 mana, draw 9 cards, assuming that you can get 9 damage through. But I think the way that you want to build this as a commander is to play all of the 1 mana, deal 1 damage to each opponent and creature they control. So like End the Festivities, there's a few variants of this type of effect, but this for only 1 mana deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. So as long as you can keep slinging spells with End the Festivities, it's going to continue to draw you cards if Niv Mizzet Visionary is is not dealt with, and so you can just sort of stack these up and storm off in a giant turn if you get like a mana geyser or something. But I think that really this is going to be just a pretty solid storm deck within the Izzet colors. A 6-mana commander is a little sketch in 2024 Commander, but I think that it really just has the ability to win you the game on the spot if it survives and you untap with it. So that's Niv Mizzet Visionary. Then that brings us to Kykar, Zephyr, Awakener, 4-mana 3/4 bird wizard with flying. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose one, exile another creature you control, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, and create a 1/1 spirit creature token with flying. So just taking a quick look at the old Kykar Winds Fury. I believe Kykar Winds Fury is more powerful than Kykar Zephyr Awakener. With Zephyr Awakener, if you were to have the cards be blinked immediately, you could easily combo off, and this thing would be an incredibly dangerous machine because you could just go infinite with it almost immediately with your various like Ghostly Flicker type of combos. Because of Zephyr Awakener stipulation where they return at the beginning of the next end step, I still think Kykar Winds Fury is a better commander. I think with Zephyr Awakener, you probably want to use this to effectively double your instant and sorcery flicker spells. So your various ephemerates, I would treat this as, you know, deploy a bunch of really small 1 and 2, maybe even some 3 CMC blink creatures, and then as you draw your 1 and 2 CMC flicker spells, then you get the Kykar effect where you will blink another creature in addition to your creature you're blinking with the ephemerate effects, and so you basically turn all of your single target flicker spells into ghostly flickers where they can target more than one thing. I guess later in the game, if you need to assemble like a lot of board presence, you can switch to making spirits. I wouldn't really play this as a bird tribal, wizard tribal, or spirit tribal commander, just because I don't know that those tribes necessarily care about casting non-creature spells. So I think you have to really lean into the instants and sorceries for blink effects, and then just lean into the first blink ability on Zephyr Awakener. So just a kind of an awkward commander, if I'm not going to lie. I think it's just a little bit odd, but it does also protect your creatures, which is kind of nice. So Kykar Zephyr Awakener, if you guys build a deck around it, let me know in the comments how that goes. I'd be curious to understand which direction you take it. Next, we have Koma World Eater, 7 mana, 8/12. This spell can't be countered. Trample, ward 4, and whenever Koma deals combat damage to a player, create 4 3/3 blue serpent creature tokens named Koma's Coil. This is not as good as the original Koma. However, I think that this is a solid army in a can. But the question I ask myself is, at 7 mana, there's a lot you can be doing that gives you an army in a can right away, instead of having to wait to do combat damage to something. For example, Avenger of Zendikar will give you all of those plants tokens immediately, and it can actually go both wider and taller than Koma World Eater. So I think you just need to care about synergizing with the combat damage trigger. It's a little bit more protected than something like an Avenger of Zendikar, but that's not quite enough to really kick out Avenger of Zendikar for me personally. So I think this would be great in a Felix 5 Boots deck where you're doubling combat damage trigger. It curves out nicely with Felix 5 Boots. You go 5, 6, 7. By then, theoretically, you should be able to win the game. I think it's probably pretty rare to be able to play a Koma and then untap with it. Then once you deal combat damage, you make the tokens. Then you have to untap again and swing out with the tokens. So it's just very slow, and you really have to be giving this thing haste, which I believe a lot of Felix 5 Boots decks do pack various like Lightning Greaves effects and stuff to actually get your combat damage synergies a lot sooner. So Koma World Eater, interesting card, but for 7 mana, I'm just looking for something a little bit quicker than dealing combat damage to create essentially 12 power on board. Next we have Alesha, Who Laughs at Fate, 3 mana 2/2 human warrior with first strike. Whenever it attacks, put a 1/1 counter on it, and at the beginning of your end step, if you attacked this turn, and notably Alesha herself does not need to attack, return target creature card with mana value less than or equal to Alesha's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. The old Alesha, I think, is worse than this new Alesha. New Alesha allows you to just sit on the battlefield and reanimate things on your end step. So I think this could be a somewhat decent reanimation commander. I just don't know if it's good enough to compete with the reanimation commanders of 2024. So I think you would have to synergize with this by buffing its power in some way. So something like a Black Blade Reforge to maybe buff up that creature and then be putting just like maybe littler guys with maybe powers between 2 and 4 into your graveyard. That's sort of where I would brew around Alesha. Or you could lean into like the Hate Bear synergies. So in particular, I really like Douthie Voidwalker in this deck because you can get the value off of Douthie by casting that spell for free, and it is nice enough to go into the graveyard, and then you can just reanimate that on end step. Or if you were to reanimate all of these like ritual type of effects, like a Reckless Barbarian will allow you to add 2 red, so you can quote unquote ramp with Alesha's ability in a weird way. So there's some different ways you can brew around Alesha. I just don't know if there's enough sort of small bodies that you can be reanimating all the time, especially without white. The new Raise the Past from White Foundations is you're going to really want to play this, and to exclude white from the color identity of Alesha, I think, is a huge mistake. Honestly, I think this should be a Mardu commander, because with white you can lean into a lot more reanimation effects. It's an okay reanimation commander, I guess, for 2024, but this is one of those cards that's clearly designed for standard and not commander. Next, we have our honorable mentions for our multicolored cards, and there's just a couple here. Elenda, Saint of Dusk, 4-mana 4/4 Vampire Knight with lifelink and hexproof from instance. As long as your life total is greater than your starting life total, she gets +1/+1 and has menace. And she gets an additional +5/+5 as long as your life total is at least 10 greater than your starting life total. Elenda is the classic example of win more, and I don't think I would put this in any decks and even run this as a commander, because she suffers from the problem that if you are below your starting life total, she is simply a 4/4 lifelink, which is not impressive at all. And even if she gets that +1/+1 and has menace by just being between 40 and 50 life, that's still not really that impressive for 4 mana. And to be a essentially 10/10 lifelink menace hexproof from instance, if you're above 50 life, well, if you're above 50 life, you're probably already winning the game in some fashion. You might be planning on using an Aetherflux Reservoir. So if you wanted to run this as a commander, I think you'd have to lean into the Voltron strategy while also gaining life. So I actually really like the new Leyline Axe. It's a little bit expensive. The problem with Elenda is that if you lean into like equipment or auras, she doesn't give you any synergy pieces to make those, equip for cheaper or just be able to play them for free. But something like a Leyline Axe is exactly what Elenda would want on her, essentially because it gives her +1/+1, double strike, and trample. So if we have a 10/10, if they're equipped, it would be a 11/11 double strike and trample. Now we're talking for power in 2024 commander, but really you already spent, if you assume that Leyline Axe is not on the battlefield from the beginning of the game, you spent 11 mana to get to a an 11/11 double strike trample. And at that point, I'd just rather be doing other stuff. So I don't know that she really quite makes the cut. In standard, again, I think this is really more designed for standard, where a 4/4 lifelink for 4 is decent, but in commander, she just doesn't quite make the cut. And then we have Dreadwing Scavenger, 3-mana 2/2 Nightmare Bird with flying. Whenever this creature enters or attacks, draw a card, then discard a card, and this creature gets +1/+1 and has Death Touch as long as there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard. This card is not as good as a Baleful Strix in my personal opinion. I think that there are some decks that would want to leverage the draw then discard to start putting stuff into your graveyard to reanimate later, but it doesn't give you that Death Touch right away. And so this is one of those, another example where this is really designed for standard. We already have Baleful Strix in commander, so I just don't know why you would play this over Baleful Strix unless you really cared about, or you just ran them side by side, I guess, if you're in like a Dimir Bird deck or something like that. But the fact that you have to work for the Death Touch is a real turnoff for this card. And that brings us to our top 3 multicolored cards from Foundations. Here we have, drumroll please, Niv Mizzet Visionary, Zimone Paradox Sculptor, and Koma World Eater. Really, I think Niv Mizzet and Zimone are the 2 most powerful multicolored cards from this set. Koma is definitely not on the same tier as these other cards. I think Niv Mizzet Visionary will just win you the game if left alone, and Zimone will also win you the game if left alone, because you're just going to be giving so much power and toughness on board. Koma, again, it suffers from the slowness problem. If you have haste, taste, it's great. If not, you're just a little bit too slow to be playing this at the 7 mana slot. So that is the video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like on it and subscribe to see more set reviews from me. I will be making a Jumpstart 2025 video coming up here soon, so stay tuned for that. But that's where I'll wrap up the video, guys. Thank you all for watching, and hopefully we'll see you all in the next one.